I'm trying to think of what a good example is. So, what would it look like to have a world where we valued things and where it wasn't the market that was allocating resources according to supply and demand, but there were other forces at work? Well, one example, in fact, an example that's springing up all over the world now is something called participatory budgeting. And this happens at a municipal level. It was pioneered in Brazil, where the Workers' Party kind of pushed it in, and the vision is that when a city is deciding how to spend its money, wouldn't it be a good idea if the citizens of that city were part of that decision, as opposed to sort of faceless bureaucrats who are following some formula or who are corrupt in some way, making spending allocations according to whoever bribed them the most. So participatory budgeting is a very interesting way of assigning and allocating resources that have nothing to do with money. I mean, usually the ways that these budgeting decisions are taken are by the poorest people in the city who get together in local assemblies, and then those decisions are communicated up into citywide assemblies. Now, if we were going to allocate resources purely according to the basis of an ability to pay, then the city's poorest residents wouldn't be able to afford those resources. But because those resources are controlled democratically, poor people can make decisions about, well, we want a school here, we want a hospital here, we want we want it sequenced in this order because this would be fairest and this would be this would cover the most people. And people taking political responsibility for themselves and actually engaging in democracy we can get a taste of what valuing looks like under that process by looking at things like participatory budgeting, which we find not only in Brazil now, but actually in a number of places across the world. And this is interesting because this gets us into a question about democracy and about what democracy is. And I mean, one of the things that I think is important for us to recognize is that pretty much none of us live in a democracy. We live in a kind of complainocracy where if we whine loudly enough, then the bastards who are in charge of us can be replaced by different bastards who are in hoc to slightly different interests and who will run the government in slightly different ways, but are essentially sort of following the same kind of plan. But that's not really what democracy is like. And if you go back to the original democracy, if you go back to Athens, classical Athens had, obviously, let's get out of the way the fact that, yes, there was slavery in Athens, and yes, women were excluded. Athenian democracy isn't something one wants to replicate, but it is something to learn from. Because Athenian democracy worked like this. There were no elections in Athenian democracy. Instead, 6,000 citizens were chosen at random at the beginning of every year to take charge of the city. And they would be split up into groups of 500. And those 500 sort of courts of citizens would be the law for a whole year. And then at the end of the year, another 6,000 people would be chosen, again, at random. And it was every citizen's duty to take responsibility for themselves and for their fellow citizens. And people who didn't want to do this were called idiots. This is one of the sort of original ideas of Athenian democracy, of democracy itself, is that it's part of the obligation and the duty of every citizen and the privilege of every citizen to be able to clean up after yourself. I mean, we all know about sort of personal responsibility and personal hygiene, and we're encouraged to buy the right thing and shop in the right place and get around by the right kinds of transportation. But as soon as we try and take political responsibility, people look at you like you're slightly bonkers. But if we're concerned about democracy, then that's exactly what democracy is about. Democracy is about taking personal responsibility for yourself in a political way. And Athenian democracy was all about that. And I think that what we have at the moment is intended to de-skill us. The education system we have, the mechanisms for political process and engagement that we have are intended really to turn us into sort of drooling idiots when it comes to political responsibility. And I think that there are movements and organizations around the world that offer us a glimpse into what it would be like if we did take political responsibility for ourselves. And they're not perfect, and people people make mistakes. But of course, that's the point. What in many ways we're fighting for is the right to make our own mistakes, because at the moment we're suffering the consequences of other people's mistakes. And democracy means getting the right to make your own, clean up after yourself, and learn from it. Right now, we spend a lot of time cleaning up after a handful of sort of plutocrats. And I think actually getting democracy back involves re-empowering ourselves to be able to make our own mistakes and to learn from them.